Today we have a reading for 13th Sunday after Pentecost, and our passage would be Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 15 to 20. That's one of the pivotal points, in a sense, in the book of Deuteronomy. The Deuteronomy itself, as we have talked about this many times, as well you should be aware of, Moses basically starts roughly, the plan is like this. Moses starts with a historical introduction into what happened during the wilderness period, and how he reminds people how they went through and so on and so forth. Then chapter 34 basically describes the death of Moses, or kind of actually not even necessarily death, his disappearance. I mean, he goes on the mountains and nobody knows what happened. Then we have chapters 32, 33. There is a song and the follow-up with a song. And then 31. In 31, he puts Joshua in his place, so Joshua succeeds to Moses. Okay, we have blessings and curses, 27, 29. And then basically from 5 to 26 we have 10 commandments and then exposition of 10 commandments. Okay? Or 10 words if you want. Okay? So our passage is chapter 30 here, when he concludes blessings and curses, and when he says, I see, I have said before you good and evil, life and death, and if you will believe. So that's the conclusion of blessings and curses. Okay, so that's roughly kind of like a very generic structure of the whole book of Deuteronomy. As have been said many times, there are people who do believe that the book of Deuteronomy was not really written by Moses. It was written much, much later. And people come up with this date. They think it was done during King Josiah, king. And they think it was basically not found in the days of Josiah, but it was written in the days of Josiah to give a religious / political background for his reforms. So before, everything was kind of okayish. Now he wanted to change it and to give a historical explanation or historical background why he wanted to change it. He came up with the high priest, with a bunch of prophets. He came up with this kind of long book to explain to people of Israel why he's right. Okay, I don't think so, because there are too many things that we have in the book of Deuteronomy that pop up earlier, before Josiah, to show us what the problems were among the people. One of them, if just for fun you go to Deuteronomy 17 in verses, give me a second, in verses 14 to 17, we have three main laws concerning a king. So what king should not do? And if you go to 1 Kings 10, I believe 10:14 first. If you go into 1 King chapter 10, start with verse 14. Yes, I'm correct. And 14 to 11:8. This block, you see how Solomon, step by step, breaks 3 laws of what kings should not do. And partially that's why his kingdom gets in trouble. Okay? If Deuteronomy was composed later on in the days of Josiah, that means these rules are not applicable to Solomon. And his kingdom should not be in trouble. There should be no problem with that. So this is just one of the small examples how we can see that the book of Deuteronomy should be applicable for the kings even prior to the times of Josiah. Now let us go into our text today, and it's kind of very compact. It's very juicy, I would say, even in a sense, even though there are only a few verses. Okay, so, and we'll go as usual, we'll go verse by verse. So, okay, verse 15. See, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil. Okay? Sometimes in different translations you can see instead of, like, for example, instead of evil, there would be some phrase like adversity or something like this. Moses presents himself in this long sermon that has few parts. So if you believe your pastor preaches too long, compare his sermons to, let's say, 33 chapters of Deuteronomy. I mean, so probably it's not even close. So in his long sermon, by the end of the block of curses and blessings and curses, he says this phrase, I set before you. So like in front, before your eyes, now. Okay? It's the point, in a sense, to make the choice. Similar, not identical, but similar phrase we can find in the book of Joshua. He, as a disciple of Moses, he says similar thing in Joshua 24. When he gathers elders of Israel, he tells them, verses 14 and 15. Now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods of your fathers served beyond river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day or today whom you will serve, whether gods of your fathers that have served beyond the river, or the gods of Amorites in this. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So that's the point of choice. You need to be determined from today, now and forward. So I said before you, what's the choices? And the choice is, there is life and good, and there is death and evil. Okay? And that's very interesting. Okay, life and death, that's kind of understandable, and we will talk about that a little bit later on, because the way how he puts it and the way it develops in the future, it is very important for us to understand, especially the place of life, connection between life and commandments in Pauline theology. Okay, so right now we have life, apparently, versus death, and good versus evil. Later on, in verses in verse 19, therefore choose life, okay? Or I have called heaven and earth, verse 19, to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse, okay? So it has a little bit different pairs, but the meaning is still the same, okay? So we have life versus death, we have good versus evil. The important thing is evil, or let me do it in different colors so we can see better a difference. Okay, so evil in Hebrew is ra. Okay? Interestingly enough, the word is ra, sounds like evil in Hebrew is ra. And that's important because we still need to remember that this is a group of people, huge group of people. I mean, 600,000 men with their wives, with their kids, moving through the desert. I mean, it's kind of like a huge, huge nation, you know, going through their wilderness adventure. 40 years ago, they moved out of Egypt, where the God of Sun, S-U-N, was called Ra. Okay? So that's very important. It's not simply evil like evil, not only. There is a phonetical connection between God, worshiping of God of Sun. As I said, you know, it's S-U-N. This kind of sun. Sorry. Sun, God. Even though sun in Hebrew is a completely different word, but there is a phonetical connection between evil, Ra, and God, Ra. You know, so that's, I believe, that's what he does. He did it on purpose. So, verse 16. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, that I command to you today, by loving Lord your God, by walking his ways, and by keeping commandments, statutes, rules, that you shall live and multiply, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to take possession of it. Okay? So there are three important things. Okay? In verse 16, we have loving the Lord. Okay? We have walking in his way. And we have also keeping or guarding. Okay? The verb shamar, let's stay with keeping. And there are a few things to keep. We'll come back to that. But this verb not only means following, but it also means guarding. To have kind of like a boundary, kind of like a fence, and make sure that you do not go further out, but you do not stay too compact inside. I mean, you have a space to develop. Okay, that's important. So sometimes you can hear that the Pharisees of the Jesus days are bad guys because they had a fence around the fence. I mean, they put the fence around the law, and they kind of showed what people can do and what cannot. Yes and no. I mean, in some instances, let's put it this way, their exegesis or their hermeneutical exposition or application went too far. Possibly, on the other hand, their intent was to give people space. How can you develop in their modern, for their understanding, modern age, and yet to be inside of this fence of the law. And the law, as we know it, those commandments, the 5 books of Moses, were given to make sure that we have life, and we live good life. As later on, Jesus would say, I came to give you life and give you life in abundance. Okay, so really good life. Okay, excuse me. Important thing is, it starts with loving the Lord. I mean, and that's what sometimes Western Christians have a problem with. How can you command somebody to love another person or even deity? We need to understand that the verb ahav or love means more like a faithfulness. So since we are in the covenant with the Lord, since circumcision or in those days or in the baptism, we need to show our love to the Lord through our faithful obedience. Therefore, the next one is walking in His way. If we'll jump actually to the Psalm, which is assigned for today, and it is Psalm 1, that's basically what we find over there. In Psalm 1, we have, blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked. But, verse 2, his delight is in Torah of the Lord, or the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. So, to make sure that he is with proper relationship with the Lord, he walks not in the wrong way, he walks in his way, and knowing where to go, he needs to meditate on this law day and night. So what do we have? We have keeping commandments, statutes, and rules, and then, so three things here, commandments, statutes, and rules, and then, what's the follow-up with it? Then you shall live and multiply. Okay? And the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to take possession. Okay? You are entering to take this possession of this land not because you are so cool. I mean, they are not so cool. The reason is we find in the very last verse of our today's passage. In verse 20, again, loving the Lord your God, obeying His voice, and holding fast to Him, so He is your life and length of your days. So all the passages kind of over and over and over again repeats this idea. You will have life and either multiplication or life and length of your day, or you will have a life and this life will be blessed, and so on and so forth. So He is your life and length of your day, and you may dwell in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give to you, to give to them, and then you have it. Okay? So the thing is, the entrance in the land is a fulfillment of the promise that Lord gave to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Basically, it happened roughly 450, almost 500 years ago. Okay? Because they stayed in the under dominion of Egypt for about 430 years, since Abraham first time entered into Egypt, and we find this story in Genesis chapter 12. And from 430 years till their exodus, then 40 years in the wilderness, we have about 470 years between Abraham, his first promise, and fulfillment of the promise that we find here. Okay, so for about 470, almost 500 years, that's the promise. Now it can be fulfilled, but on the other hand, it requires for the people to be diligent with how they love the Lord, walk in His ways, and keep commandments, statutes, and rules. Verse 17, and if your heart turns away, and you will not hear or you will not do, we've talked about this verb. Shema is not only here in the sense of you know, the sound waves got into your ear and it kind of vibrated, and you have this you hear the words. In Hebrew, in biblical language, to hear and not to obey means you didn't hear it. Okay, that's all together. If you hear it, you obey it. You just do it. Okay? So if you will not hear, verse 17, but you are drawn away to worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you today, follow up with verse 18, that you shall surely perish. Okay? Again, interesting phrase that we find almost identical to Psalm 1, as I said today. The very last verse, or let's say verses 5 and 6. Therefore, the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. But the Lord knows the way of the righteous, and the way of the wicked will perish. And sometimes we can hear and see the, how can I say, pessimistic or gloomy understanding of future. It does not mean that every day of our life will be bright, but since Calvary and since resurrection and after ascension, the essential, a little bit different word, after ascension, essential victory is won. Okay, we know it. Even there, even here in Deuteronomy, we see the expectation that the wicked lifestyle will surely perish. I mean, if you will be in a proper relationship with the Lord, you will stay in the land. If you will not, you will be out of the land. And that's what we find in second book of Kings. They were out of the land. And the reason is, the very simple reason is, they rejected the Lord. They did not love the Lord. They replaced him with other deities, and that's what we find in the book of Ezekiel, especially in chapters 8 to 11. They were not walking in his way. They did not keep the commandments. They were doing whatever they wanted to do. They actually followed their hearts. So I have a serious problem with the phrase of following your heart, because even before, prior to this passage, many years actually before this passage, almost in the very beginning of the journey in the wilderness, in chapter 15 of book of Numbers, we have the law about tassels on the garments. And then the Lord said to Moses, it's chapter 15, verses 37 to the end, to 41. Let me write it down. So in Numbers, so in verses 17, 18, we have important part about the heart, and we always need to go back to Numbers. It's not the only passage, but one of the, I would say, like parade example of how Bible treats the heart of man. So what we have is, the Lord said to Moses, speak to the people of Israel and tell them to make tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and to put a cord of blue on the tassel of each corner, and it shall be a tassel for you to look and remember the commandments of the Lord, and do them, and not to follow after your own heart and your own eyes, which you are inclined to whore after. I'm sorry for language, that's English Standard Version, but that's what it is. I mean, if your heart and your eyes are not trained to do what is in the consistency with loving the Lord, walking in his ways, and keeping his commandments, statutes, and rules, it will look wherever else, instead of keeping this relationship right and maintained, it will lead you wherever heart may lead you, which will not necessarily be great. Okay? So, second part of verse 18. You shall not live long in the land. that you are going over the Jordan to enter and possess. So, even if Lord promises them, there will be an entrance, there will be a glorious grabbing the land or occupying the land, but if they will not be in proper relationship, it will be broken. It will be, they will not stay in the land. There are other phrases in the Bible like the land will spit you out. Okay, kind of like that. That's what happened. I mean, unfortunately, that's what happens in some of the marriages. I mean, you have glorious wedding, everything is fine. First few days is great. Then you have some years. Then troubles start to maintain and build up, and then people separate. People divorce. Okay, so that's kind of like, instead of keeping relationship in the normal level, people led it to divorce with the Lord. And he divorced them from their land. Now, verse 19. It is important in the connection to some of the previous passages. Now, see how he goes further, because he's on the plain of Moab. He has people in front of him. He preaches to them. And it's basically him and people. Yet, Bible says that every word will be supported by 2 or 3 witnesses. What kind of witnesses he uses? Now see, verse 19. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today, that I have set before you life and death, we talked about that, life and death, and life and death, blessing and a curse. Okay? So therefore, choose life. And he encourages them, choose life that you and your offspring might live. Okay? So they will have life. Interesting. He goes into theology of creation. So in some sense, in verse 19, I would go here. We need to go back to the very, very beginning. Okay? Genesis 1, verses 1 and 2. On the other hand, that's what became for background in the future. If we'll go to book of Isaiah, chapter 1, verse 2, what will we have there? In book of Isaiah, chapter 1, verse 2, we will see how Isaiah, or how God actually, through Isaiah, starts. The vision of Isaiah, the son of Amos, verse 2. Hear, or heaven, and give ear, or earth, for the Lord has spoken. Children have I reared and brought up, but they have rebelled against me. And that's why it is important to see this connection, that at the very end of Isaiah, especially in 65, I believe 17, let me check myself. We talked about this passage a few, maybe months already ago. Yeah. Behold, I create renewed heavens and renewed earth, because the former things shall not be remembered. So there is this idea and there is this theology of heaven and earth as environmental witnesses. Okay, so the witnesses that will not pass, that always with us, because I mean, whatever happens with you, you wake up and heaven are still above you, and most likely you still, 2 feet can put 2 feet on the ground. So these two main witnesses are with you. And even further, it goes into most glorious development into Revelation 21:1 and to the end of the book. Okay? When John says, I saw new heaven and new earth. So it, as a part of development of this great theology of creation from the very beginning to the very end of the Bible, we have verse 19, that in Deuteronomy chapter 30, where it says that I set heaven and earth to witness against you. Not necessarily it would be a bad witness. I mean, it depends of the people. If they will act properly, if they will be loving the Lord, walking in His ways, and keeping His statutes, His rules and commandments, then the witness would be great. But if not, that's what it is. Okay? So, therefore, as I said, second part of verse 19, therefore choose life that you and your offspring may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying His voice, and holding fast to Him. For He is your life and length of the day, and you may dwell in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give to them. So, if they wanted to stay in this blessed promise, they had to love the Lord, walk in His ways, or as verse 20 puts it, they had to love the Lord their God, obey His voice, kind of like hear, as we have mentioned in the previous verses, hear and holding, basically grabbing to Him, holding to Him, because He is the life, okay? And that's what Jesus said many times. I am the way, the truth, and the life, okay? So that's the life and the length of the days. So we can dwell in the land. We do not dwell in a particular land right now. We are dwelled in the blessing of the Lord. And therefore, with this knowledge of this particular scripture, you might stay blessed.